Picture a quiet corridor, lights dimmed, no movement around you. Everything feels contained. The story begins gently, without urgency, designed for sleep. I remember the world from the briefing holo before I remember it from the ground. On the holo, it was clean lines and output graphs, a grid of fungal terraces wrapped around a central sea, everything quantified in nutrient units per cycle. A central Terran world, they called it, linchpin of an entire sector's food chain. Stable climate, optimized soil, gene-tailored organisms. The kind of place that kept fleets moving and cities fed, and the stock prices calm. From orbit, it did not look like the holo. From the drop bay viewport, the planet was dim in patches, like something had been eating its light from the inside. Bands of dark across the green-gray surfaces, bloom patterns where production should have been symmetrical. The atmosphere carried high particulate counts, spores thick enough to smear sensor returns. We were told the Resistance had done that. If you repeat a story enough times, it starts to feel like truth for the duration of a contract. The bay was quiet before insertion. Even the new ones did not talk much in the suits. Most of us had already read the line in the op order that said recon elements were low retrieval priority. When command writes you down as a value in a column, you do not waste air pretending otherwise. It was supposed to be uncomplicated. Contract troops had gone in first, corporate security and heavier armor with blunter rules of engagement. They had vanished into the haze and come back only as interrupted telemetry and, eventually, a long silence. Food shipments stopped. Accounts froze. The corporation shouted for compensation and cleansing. The main council overrode them and sent in a siege fleet instead. I was attached to that fleet. One platoon among many, flagged as recon and target designation. Our job was simple enough to write on one line. Drop in, stay dark, find out what was happening, and mark the places that needed to die. The only complication was that this time, the enemy was not just a number. We went in at night on the ground, though orbital night means little when half the light comes from weapon platforms and powered orbits. The insertion pod rode a quiet burn, most of its signature hidden in the larger heat wash of gunships and decoys. Acceleration pressed my spine into the rig, old shrapnel under scar tissue sending dull pulses up my back. I watched the green-gray ball swell and flatten beneath us, then give way to clouds like mold on liquid. The pod cut atmosphere with a sound like tearing bone conducted through the suit. Exterior plates glowed, then blackened. Retros fired in measured coughs. The hull shook and moaned around us. The younger troopers kept their helmets forward, focusing on HUD data. I watched the vibration of my own gloved hands where they rested on the maglock bar. It kept pace with my breathing until I forced it slower. We hit low over the fungal basins, a cold slap of drag, and then the hard jolt of impact legs punching into soft ground. The pod split open on cue, pedal doors unfolding in silence. The air outside rolled in as a pale fog, suit filters spiking warnings until they adjusted the thresholds and declared it survivable. That was another column in someone else's spreadsheet. We moved out in staggered lines, suits low, rail carbines cradled, the pod sinking slowly into the wet substrate behind us. Fungal terraces stretched away in all directions, layered like 1,000 shallow steps filled with pulsing growth. Fluids trickled along narrow channels between them, catching distant orbital glows and turning them into sluggish veins of light. There was no obvious enemy, just wind dragging spores and long, lazy sheets over everything, and the faint, constant crackle in our ears as the suit sensors tried to make sense of a world built out of signal noise. We deployed the first microdrone cluster 5 minutes after landing. The swarm lifted from the launcher on my back in a tight plume, then broke apart into individual motes, each sending back a different slice of the spectrum. On the tactical overlay, the terrain built itself in layers as they mapped it: contours of terraces, heat traces from subsurface flows, residual energy signatures from old machinery. No identifiable threats, no movement that looked like anything other than environmental processes. It was wrong in the way an empty battlefield is wrong. I have seen too many of those. The absence of bodies is almost worse. It means they were taken for a reason. We pushed forward. Old contract armor lay half swallowed by the fungal mass in places, marked on our HUDs by their passive transponders still whispering in low power. One suit lay on its back with its chest plate torn open, mycelium thrusting through the gap like pale ribs. Another was propped against a growth column, helmet missing, spinal harness bent in a way that told me the occupant had not walked away. Their weapons were gone. That was notable. Assault rifles, even sealed under corrosion, should have left signatures. The fact that they did not meant someone had taken them long enough ago for the world to digest the residue. My orders were to ignore salvage. We walked past them, our own boots leaving shallow dents that oozed back into shape behind us. Contact came 28 minutes after insertion. It began with a drone going dark. One mode of the swarm flickered off the overlay, then another, then a cluster, all from the same vector. Their last transmissions were corrupted by static that did not match any jamming pattern in our library. It looked more like an organic process, noise that rose from baseline and devoured the signal. I redirected the rest of the swarm away from that region and sent 2 drones high to look down across it. Their feeds showed what looked at first like another terrace, a shallow depression filled with unusually dense growth, darker threads running through it. Heat signatures were low, indistinguishable from the surrounding substrate. The 3rd drone dipped lower to get a better angle. It cut through the vapor layer, its optics adjusting, and then the feed smeared to gray. By the time I realized what I was seeing, the ground beneath us had already begun to breathe. The terrace surface ahead of the point man bulged upward in a slow swell, then split along radial seams I had taken for growth lines. The bulges resolved into jointed limbs, slick with moisture and particulate. A head unfolded from the center, not a separate piece, but an extension of the same structure, eyes opening as if grown in the instant between one heartbeat and the next. Spider-like, but elongated, with too many joints in each leg and a carapace that looked more like desiccated reptile skin than insect shell. It pulled itself up and out of the fungus that had concealed it, dragging a body that must have been folded impossibly tight inside. All around it, other mounds were rising, shedding debris as they resolved into the same form. Lower caste. That was the term from the brief. Labor organisms originally. Burrowing, carrying, harvesting. The old corporate files had shown them harnessed to sleds and carts, moving silent loads across dawn-lit terraces. These ones were not harnessed. They carried only their own limbs and the memory of what had been done to them. We did what we were trained to do. The suits measured distances, calculated trajectories, predicted likely approaches. My orders went out in bursts of compressed data, arcs of fire, fallback routes, target priorities. The troopers complied without words because words cost air and attention. Rail carbines spat hypervelocity slugs that tore limbs from bodies, pinning some of the spider things to the terrace edges. Green-black fluid sprayed in arcs that steamed where they hit the warm fungal mats. The creatures moved in patterns that shifted as they died, adjusting angles of attack, changing pressure on our flanks. Somewhere behind them, something was learning from their failure. They did not scream. That stayed with me even then. No vocalizations beyond the scrape of chitin or bone against the ground, the wet friction of their movement. Corporate files had mentioned a vocal range, but that had probably been one of the first things silenced. Tools do not need voices. We broke contact with minimal damage. One trooper down, suit breached at the thigh, mycelium already probing the wound when we dragged him back and sealed it with foam. His breathing was ragged on the net, but his vitals settled when the drugs hit his system. He would be mobile for now. The swarm recorded everything. The data packet built itself in the background, compiled and cross-referenced with the old intel. It would not be enough, but it was a start. We pressed deeper. As we moved downhill, terraces widened and deepened. Fungal forms grew taller, more elaborate, stacking upon themselves in chimneys and fluted towers. The air grew thicker with spores, filters cycling harder, each breath a work of machinery more than biology. The sky overhead was a pale, featureless gray. Whatever stars existed beyond it reduced to dim smudges behind particulate. Winged shapes appeared in that murk before long. At first they were only shadows crossing above now and then, their outlines distorted by the haze. Then one dipped lower through a gap in the clouds, whatever sensory organs it had no doubt drawn by the heat plume of our suits. Raptor form, airborne cast. Another tool, retooled. Its body was long and narrow, limbs reshaped into wings that were more membrane than feather, but the underlying structure was the same as the spider lower we had fought. Same skin, same bone, redeployed into the air. It circled us at a distance while more forms joined it in the haze, layering their signatures until they became a shifting cloud of potential threat. Our ECM tried to confuse them with decoy emissions. That bought us some distance, but not enough. They adapted, tightening their orbits, testing the edges of our formation. The first strike came from above and behind, as they usually do. A raptor form folded its wings and dropped its speed, something clutched beneath its torso. Sensors flagged the object as anomalous moments before it hit the lead element. The charge did not explode so much as dissolve. A sphere of filament and fluid burst across the exosuit's back, eating into the armor with a sound the pickups rendered as a low hiss. The trooper staggered, suit integrity alarms flaring bright red over the net. He held his ground long enough to pivot and fire a burst into the ascending raptor, tearing half of it away in a spray of wet debris. Then he went face down, the armor collapsing inward as the biogenic charge digested its way in. We threw suppressive fire into the sky, not because we expected to hit much, but because it tightened their approach vectors. They began to use cover, skimming just above the fungal towers, dropping in lower where they could. Each pass shaved another layer off our armor or took a bite out of someone who stood a fraction too long in the wrong place. I marked the aerial cluster as a threat for potential orbital attention, but we were too deep under atmospheric cover for the big guns to risk shot. The siege fleet's doctrine on collateral was flexible when it came to non-human worlds, but my coordinates were not high enough yet on their priority list to warrant punching a hole through their own spore screen. We moved, staying low, keeping towers between us and the sky when possible, shooting only to clear immediate threats. The Raptors shadowed us but did not commit to another decisive strike. Their pattern shifted again, testing, waiting. The objective lay ahead, a major production spine, the core of one of the original corporate complexes. From above, it had looked like a hardened industrial node. From the ground, it was something else. The complex loomed from the haze as a mass of intertwined structures, some clearly human-made, some organic, most an amalgam of both. Steel girders wrapped in grown resin, concrete foundations undermined and replaced by chitin, towers that had once pumped nutrient solutions, now sprouting fungal formations along their length like invasive vines. The overall silhouette was wrong for any standard facility I had seen. It rippled subtly, as if parts of it still moved. We approached along a dry nutrient canal, its walls stained with layers of residue from years of use. The canal took us under defensive sightlines, or what would have been defensive sightlines in a conventional war. Here, it just put us deeper into the smell of old growth and decay. Inside the complex, the air stilled. The sound profile changed from open wind to enclosed reverberation, our own footsteps taking on a hollow echo. Desiccated remnants of corporate signage clung to some walls, logos half-eaten by creeping fungus. Whatever language they had once used to motivate workers or boast of efficiency was unreadable now, the letters obscured by growths that pulsed gently with internal circulation. We found the vats in the central chamber. They rose from the floor in concentric rings, each one a cylinder of translucent material stained from within. Some still contained biomass, suspended in partially congealed fluid. Others were shattered, their contents long ago spilled and reabsorbed into the general mass. At first I thought the things inside were just alien bodies stored for processing. Then I saw the harness lines, the ports and limbs, the metal collars fused to bone. Not storage, use. Slender, multi-limbed forms were held rigid by support frames, limbs extended in unnatural positions to maximize surface area. Fungal structures grew from incisions along their torsos, threading through their organs. Tubes carried fluids away to other parts of the complex. The creatures' eyes were hollowed or overgrown, mouths sealed. They had not been allowed to die quickly. Their function had required duration. Some frames held shapes that were not alien. Human skeletons, partially stripped, partially assimilated. The fungus did not care about species when it needed a scaffold. Our suit cams recorded everything, mapping tags to each frame, logging every visible configuration. It was more than enough to satisfy an inquiry panel, if such a panel ever saw it. A central console still hummed faintly at the far end of the chamber. Its external shell was cracked and overgrown, but beneath the organic layers, its status lights flickered with intermittent life. I sent a tech specialist to breach it, while the rest of us held perimeter. The breach took longer than it should have. The console fought back in ways it had not been designed for, triggering chemical reactions in the fungus that clung to it, sending out bursts of spore at each attempted access. The tech worked through it, lungs burning, hands steady. When the core finally opened, a pale light spilled out, washing over their gauntlets. They extracted the data core and slaved it to my suit. It was heavier than it looked. Not physically, the weight came from what it contained. Corporate logs, genetic schema, development notes, before and after imaging of the species as it had been and as it had been made to be. In the before images, they stood upright, all of them. Slender, yes, but proportionate, 4 arms and 2 legs arranged in a way that made sense for bipedal movement. Their eyes showed awareness, not human, but centered, present. There were indications of tools, architecture, social structures. Words like partner, negotiator, contract appeared in the earliest text files. In the later images, they were segmented into functions. One subline became lower caste, limbs thickened and specialized, brains pared down, cortical regions suppressed. Another subline sprouted wings, an adaptation that made them more useful for aerial spraying of nutrients and pesticides. Another line was scaled up grotesquely, bones thickened, musculature reinforced until they became the giants that hauled entire growth modules from one basin to another. There were notes in the margins about efficiency gains, about cost per calorie, about maintenance intervals. There were also casualty logs. Early attempts had gone wrong, leaving subjects catatonic or screaming, unproductive. Those were written off as development losses. The fungus came later. It had not been native. It had been imported as a robust, adaptable protein source. When it did not thrive under original conditions, someone proposed grafting it into the engineered species directly. Their bodies became its habitat. Their suffering became its stability. The logs did not mention consent. They did not mention the species' own culture beyond its usefulness as an initial substrate. Their original name never appeared. The corporate files referred to them only as asset designations. I sent the compilation to the fleet in compressed bursts, each packet wrapped in priority tags so dense the channel complained. The uplink cut in and out through the biological interference, but enough got through that I received an acknowledgement ping from orbit. Nothing more, nothing less. The decision about what to do with that information was never mine. While we were buried in the vat complex, the enemy closed in. Sensors picked them up as diffuse tremors at first, vibrations through the fungal mass rather than heat blooms in open air. The giants moved slowly, but each step carried a long way. Lower castes swarmed ahead of them, filling tunnels and canals. The raptor forms shadowed overhead, their silhouettes crossing briefly over punctures in the roof where structures had collapsed. We had what we came for and more. The mission profile said withdrawal or repositioning to mark further targets. The tactical reality said we were pinned between converging forces and a structure loaded with evidence no one in power would want to see twice. I chose a direction anyway. We punched out through a maintenance shaft on the far side of the complex, its walls slick with residue that clung to our boots. Outside, the ground sloped downward into what had once been a drainage basin. Now it was a hollow filled with a slow churning mass of fungus, its surface broken by emerging towers and the occasional pale protrusion that might once have been a support column. The giant waited on the far rim. Calling it a giant is imprecise, but there are few other human words that suffice. It was a moving hill of bone and cartilage, its core structure derived from the largest of the original labor castes and then multiplied. Limbs that might once have hauled loads now braced its mass against the slope. Along its spine rose artillery nodules, growths that pulsed and then spat globs of accelerated matter into the air, which arced and detonated as they fell. Embedded in its flanks, like barnacles on a hull, were pods containing lower caste forms ready to deploy. Its skin still bore remnants of harness points from its time as a carrier of fungal loads. They had been swallowed by new growths, but their shapes were still visible beneath. It had been a tool. Now it was a weapon. Both roles had been forced upon it. We were within its engagement envelope. Its first volley came in as a series of pressure spikes, and then impacts that turned terraces to slurry. Shock waves hit like physical entities, my ribs rattling inside my suit despite the dampers. One trooper vanished in a geyser of churning fungus and fluid, his transponder ping cut off mid-pulse. We scattered, each of us calculating angles that might reduce the giant's ability to track us all at once. I watched its artillery nodules adjust, tiny shifts in angle that told me some kind of central mind was updating firing solutions continuously. That mind might have been a network of upper caste controllers somewhere behind the lines, or a set of biologic structures inside the giant itself. The distinction did not matter to us in the basin. Our weapons were not designed to kill something that size alone, but we had something that could. Target designators work on line of sight and coordinates. They do not care what sits at those coordinates. If you paint something for orbit and the siege fleet chooses to answer, you can burn an ocean or a city with the same sequence of movements. The complication was that orbital assets were already engaged across the planet. Fire missions had to be weighed against others. Collateral acceptability rose and fell with the flow of battle. A recon platoon at the bottom of a basin was low on the list. We moved anyway, seeking elevation, trying to find angles where a designator ping would not die in the haze. Lower caste swarms poured into the basin walls, climbing down toward us. Their bodies stuck to the fungal surfaces with ease. Our boots slipped in the churn. The air thickened with particulate until our optics showed only ghosts. The first hit on my suit came from a raptor form I never saw. One moment my left shoulder plate was intact, the next there was a spreading patch of corrosive damage feeding error strings to my HUD. The armor systems isolated the breach, rerouting power away from the compromised region, but the protection there was gone. I felt the cold seep in like a slow, patient blade. We lost contact with another squad then, their icons graying out one by one on my display. No kill confirmations, just silence. In the midst of the chaos, the data core's presence in my suit systems felt like a solid weight. All the history that had led to this moment lived in those files, the species as it had been. The decisions made in boardrooms and clean labs. The calculated cruelty of splitting a people into parts to fit an economic schema. The giants had not volunteered to carry our fungus. The lower castes had not volunteered to be growth racks. The raptors had not volunteered to seed our fields. They had been rewritten. When they rewrote themselves for war, they were only following the logic we had imposed. None of that changed the fact that they were trying to kill us efficiently. We reached the basin's mid-slope before my legs started to shake from exertion and impact fatigue. The suit's power reserves dipped below the margin I like to see. Air quality in my readings worsened as the filters fought to keep up with spore load. Every breath felt heavier, a little more borrowed. Above us, the giant's artillery nodules swiveled, tracking the glows of our suits. One of them flashed, launching another bioshell. I triggered my designator. The marker was not much to look at, just a coded pulse and a tight beam transmission, carrying coordinates and local conditions upward through layers of interference. It felt insignificant compared to the mass of the thing it targeted. The channel fought me. Static bitten by biological noise. Automatic systems recommended abort and reattempt later. I overrode them and pushed the packet through in bursts, repeating it until my queue emptied. Somewhere high above, an algorithm weighed my input against others and assigned it a slot. We did not wait for confirmation. Waiting in place would have been suicide. We kept moving, every step a negotiation between the need for speed and the risk of exposing ourselves to more fire. Lower caste bodies closed in, clinging to the slopes, reaching for our legs. We engaged at close range, rail carbines punching holes in bodies that did not stop moving until enough structure had been removed. The trooper with the thigh breach went down again, this time under a pile of limbs. I saw his vitals spike and then flatline before the mass buried him. I could not retrieve him. My path lay upward, not back. The first orbital strike arrived without warning. There is no sound from an orbital lance until the air has time to react, and then the sound comes all at once. Light hit first, a spear of white slicing down through the haze to the coordinates I had marked. For a second, the giant's outline was etched stark against the glow, every limb and nodule and growth. Then the world turned to pressure and heat. The shock wave hit like a wall, throwing me sideways down the slope. The suit's dampers screamed, then cut out as they burned through their reserves. My chest slammed against internal restraints hard enough to drive the air from my lungs despite the system's best efforts. My vision narrowed to a tunnel of gray static and then slowly expanded again. When I could see, the giant was falling. The lance had struck near its core, vaporizing a chunk of mass and destabilizing the rest. Limbs buckled, joints sheared, artillery nodules ruptured in steam and shards. Its bulk toppled forward into the basin, displacing fungal matter in a wave that rolled outward from the impact site. Creatures on its flanks were flung clear or crushed beneath it. Heat washed over everything. Fungal structures blistered and burst. The air filled with particles too small for the suit systems to classify. My optics compensated as best they could. What they showed looked like a slow-motion collapse of a living hill. Orbital fire continued, walking across the basin in measured steps. Each strike carved another crater, melted another section of growth, shook another layer of resolve out of my muscles. Somewhere in the pattern, I saw adjustment. The fire did not erase everything. Some structures on the far rim, ones that matched upper caste architectural profiles from the data core, remained untouched. Command had seen the files. They were recalibrating their idea of what needed to die. It might have been mercy. It might have been that upper caste leaders were suddenly considered a potentially useful asset. It might have been a calculation about optics if this ever reached a council chamber. All of those felt equally plausible. My platoon was no longer a platoon. When I checked the net, I saw only a scattering of isolated transponders, most of them flickering at the edge of range, some sending nothing but repeating distress codes. I sent out a general recall on the assigned band. No one answered. Evacuation windows were gone. The siege fleet had shifted posture, pulling assault shuttles back to safer orbits while heavy guns did their work. No one was coming into this basin again until it cooled and settled, if at all. I found shelter in the ruins of an old pumping station halfway up the slope. Its walls were thick concrete laced with steel, partially eaten by growth but still intact enough to stop shrapnel. Inside, it smelled of wet rock and decay. My suit's internal atmosphere filters worked overtime. There was a communications terminal in the station's ghost infrastructure, a hard line that once connected to larger networks. Whatever systems it had belonged to were long gone, but the physical links still existed, buried under encroaching organic matter. The suit's tools could talk to it in a limited way. I jacked in and piggybacked on residual bandwidth to push the full data archive upward. Everything the swarm had seen, everything the VATS had recorded. The genetic schema, the development notes, the feeds of the giant in its last moments, the way its limbs flailed, not like a machine failing, but like something that felt its own body dissolving under forces it had never evolved to comprehend. The transmission took time. Every second it ran was another second of power drain and filter wear and potential detection. I sat with my back against the pumping station wall and watched the progress bar creep upward. Outside, orbital fire continued its methodical sweep. The station shook occasionally as nearby strikes hit, dust filtering down from cracks in the ceiling. Each tremor sent little flares of pain through my old injuries. The suit dosed me with analgesics and stims on automatic schedules, its algorithm still trying to preserve a standard profile of combat effectiveness. They were working with a patient who had already drifted outside their original parameters. When the transmission finished, I tagged it with every priority flag I had clearance for and one I probably did not. Then I sent it again, in case the first version had degraded. A reply came back eventually. A simple acknowledgement, encoded, signed by an operations AI. No human text, no comment, no order. I sat there for a while longer, listening to the quiet between impacts. The lower caste swarms had withdrawn from the immediate blast region. Whether that was due to casualties or a coordinated decision, I could not tell. The raptor forms were gone from the sky. The haze still glowed faintly with reflected fire, but the intensity was dropping. Air quality inside the suit was poor. Filter elements were near saturation. Power reserves hovered below reserves I would have considered safe in any other situation. My battery of stimulants had left my heart beating a little too fast for the amount of oxygen available. These were logistics problems, not moral ones. I was better at dealing with logistics. I recorded my account because there was nothing else left to do that mattered. The suit's internal systems had more than enough memory for words. They had room for all the things I had seen and done and ordered others to do. I started at the beginning with the briefing holo and the clean lines of output graphs. Then I moved through the drop, the terraces, the spider forms, the raptors, the vats, the giants. I did not add commentary. I did not try to build a case. The images were enough. I spoke of the original species as they appeared in the early logs, standing upright, eyes focused. I spoke of the way their bodies were segmented into functions, of how their pain had been translated into profit margins, of how their resistance had translated that same logic into a different configuration, one that aimed death at us instead of at themselves. I spoke of my platoon only in terms of positions and actions. Names were for memorial walls, and I did not believe any of us would have them by the time this reached a place where such things were carved. When I reached the moment where the orbital lance struck the giant, I stopped. The memory there was clear. The light, the heat, The way its mass shifted, the sound transmitted through ground at the moment of impact, the way one enormous limb had tried to anchor itself, clawing at the slope as it slid, leaving channels that filled immediately with boiling fungal paste. The way structures along its spine had flared one by one, a line of tiny suns going out. The ground had kept moving even after it fell. The basin floor had heaved and roiled as if it did not agree with the new shape imposed on it. Even now, sitting half-sheltered in the pumping station, I could feel a low, constant vibration under the floor. The world still breathing. I sent the account along with the sensor logs, wrapped them in the same flags as the data core. The acknowledgement this time came with a modification. Orbital fire patterns adjusted. New exclusion zones appeared on my tactical overlay, places no longer slated for immediate sterilization. They were small relative to the size of the world, but they existed. Their coordinates aligned roughly with locations where the upper caste architecture still stood, where our maps had marked possible centers of higher cognition. Maybe Command had decided they needed someone to negotiate with once the fires cooled. Maybe they wanted living subjects for more studies. Maybe the evidence of what had been done had finally triggered a threshold somewhere in a Council AI's rule set. All of those possibilities were beyond my influence. My power levels ticked down another notch. The suit dimmed non-essential systems in response. External pickups lost some of their resolution. The world grew quieter. Extraction was still not coming. The fleet's traffic was all heavy guns and strategic repositioning. No light transport signatures crossed the sky in my readings. Recon elements not already aboard were categorized as spent assets. I eased down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, legs splayed in front of me, boots leaving faint smears on the concrete. The pumping station's interior smelled like stale water and neglect even through the filters. My lungs hurt anyway. I thought of the planet as it must have looked before we arrived the first time. Before corporations and councils and siege fleets. Before fungal terraces and vats and re-engineered castes. A single species, perhaps, walking under an unbroken sky, building things that made sense to them. I pushed the thought aside. It was not useful. The suit's cognitive load manager agreed and damped the emotional response that came with it. Outside, another orbital strike landed somewhere beyond the station. The structure trembled, dust sifting from seams above. The suit's inertial measures logged the impact. My heart barely reacted. I do not know how this ends for the planet, whether the exclusion zones will become sanctuaries or pens. Whether the upper caste survivors will rebuild something of what they were, or become partners in a new version of the same system. My part in that is over. I know only that the basins will not feed this sector the way they used to, not for a long time. Supply lines will tighten, prices will rise. Somewhere far from here, people will grumble about shortages without ever knowing what lay under the numbers. For me, the ending is smaller. The suit will run out of power soon. Filters will fail. The atmosphere will come in and do what it did to the others. Maybe the fungus will use me the way it used them. Maybe it will find no use in my particular composition and leave me as another piece of trash in an old station. I am leaving this record in the transmission buffers and in the local storage, in case someone comes digging later. In case anyone cares to check why the fire patterns changed that day. In case some clerk in a quiet office needs a narrative to attach to a decision log. The last image I will carry is not the giant falling or the vats or the contract suit swallowed by growth. It is the ground under my boots in the moment after the orbital lance hit. How it moved, just slightly, as if shrugging off one more wound and preparing to keep breathing in whatever shape it had left. The planet will survive. In what form, I do not know. The species we broke may survive too, in some configuration. What we were on the day we did this will survive as well, in files and craters and bones. That is my war. That is what we did. The end. That's the end of the story. You're in a stand-down moment now. No responsibilities, no noise. Stay here as long as you like.